In the unforgiving heart of the 1878 Montana Territory, a woman's worth was often measured in gold land or the strength of the man who claimed her. But what happens when she's deemed worthless? They cast her into the street, a burlap sack pulled over her head to hide her shame from God and man. She was the rejected bride, a public spectacle of failure, and the only man willing to take her was a ghost from the mountains, a recluse with more scars on his soul than dollars to his name. He paid his price, not knowing that when he finally lifted that sack, he wouldn't be looking at a stranger, but at the face of his own damnation. The town of Redemption Creek, baked under the relentless August sun, a miserable collection of clapboard and sin, huddled in a dusty valley. For Jordan Hayes, it was a necessary evil. The mountain was his home, his sanctuary, but even a man who lived off the land needed salt flour and steel traps. He'd made this trip once a season for 5 years, a silent, hulking figure in buckskin who traded prime pelts for necessities, spoke less than 10 words, and was gone before the townsfolk could finish their whispers about him. Today, however, the town was different. A cruel energy crackled in the air, drawing folks from the saloon and general store like flies to a carcass. They formed a loose, jeering circle in the center of the main street. At its heart stood a woman on the auction block, usually reserved for livestock, and a portly, red-faced man in a sweat-stained suit. Jordan tethered his pack mule, his grey eyes sharp as a hawk's narrowing to take in the scene. The man was Alex Croft, a land baron who was slowly strangling Redemption Creek with his greed. The woman... Jordan couldn't see the woman. Her hands were bound in front of her, and a coarse burlap sack smelling of potatoes and dust was pulled down over her head and cinched at her neck with a length of twine. A sign was hung around her neck, the words scrawled in crude charcoal: "Rejected. Return to sender." A faulty product, gentlemen, Croft boomed his voice, slick with false bonhomie. Promised a comely and compliant bride from the east, and what arrived was unsatisfactory, utterly unsatisfactory. Refused her duties on our wedding night, can you imagine? A wave of lewd laughter rippled through the crowd. The woman flinched, but otherwise stood as still as a statue. I paid a handsome price for her passage, and contract, Croft continued, wiping his brow with a silk handkerchief. I'd see some of it returned. What am I bidding for this? Creature. Good for scrubbing floors, perhaps. Mucking stalls, a strong back, if nothing else. Jordan felt a cold, hard knot form in his stomach. He'd seen cruelty in the wild, the wolf taking down a deer, the hawk stooping on a rabbit. That was the law of nature. This was the law of men, and it was infinitely uglier. He had come to town for 2 reasons: supplies and a half-formed, desperate idea, born of a loneliness so profound it had begun to feel like a physical ache. He'd read the advertisements in an old newspaper. Martha at the general store had wrapped his salt in mail-order brides for hardy Western men. The thought had been a seed of shame and hope in his mind. A companion. Someone to share the silence with. He'd never intended to act on it, but seeing this display of casual brutality stirred something dormant within him. He saw the slight tremor in the woman's bound hands, the way she held her spine ramrod straight beneath the humiliating sack. There was a fight in her, even in this pit of despair. $5, a grimy-looking prospector called out, spitting a stream of tobacco juice. "I'll give you 10 for her, Alex. If she's as ugly as they say, the sack can stay," on another roared to the delight of his companions. Croft's face soured. This wasn't about money. It was about power. He wanted to make an example of her. He wanted to break her. Jordan pushed through the crowd, his large frame parting the townsfolk like a ship through water. The whispers died as he approached. The mountain man. The ghost. He stopped before the auction block, his gaze fixed not on Croft, but on the burlap sack. He could smell her fear, a scent as raw and real as any animal's. He unslung a heavy pouch from his belt and tossed it onto the block. It landed with a solid, definitive thud. The clink of coins was unmistakable. "What is this?" Hayes Croft asked, his eyes narrowing with suspicion. "My winter's haul." Jordan said, his voice a low, gravelly rumble, unused to so many words at once. Beaver mink fox, top grade, worth $200 at the trading post in Bozeman. The crowd gasped. $200 was a fortune. It was more than the bride contract was ever worth. Croft's greedy eyes lit up. This was more than he could have hoped for. "You're buying her?" he asked, a sneer playing on his lips. "What's a man like you want with damaged goods?" Jordan's gaze was as cold and hard as Riverstone. "She's not good, and I'm not asking." He pulled his hunting knife from its sheath on his belt. The crowd took a collective step back. With 2 swift movements, he sliced the ropes, binding the woman's wrists. She stumbled, her hands coming up instinctively to the sack on her head. Jordan took her arm, his touch surprisingly gentle. "Come on," he grunted, turning her toward his mule. The pouch Hayes Croft called his hand, hovering over it. Jordan paused. "You touch that pouch before we're clear of town?" he said, his voice low and carrying a deadly promise. "And I'll come back for you." Alex Croft, a man who feared no one in Redemption Creek, looked into the mountain man's eyes and saw a wilderness there, vast and untamed. He did not touch the pouch. Jordan led the woman to his mule, ignoring the stunned silence of the crowd. He lifted her onto its back as if she weighed nothing. He didn't look at her, didn't speak to her. He just took the reins and began the long, slow walk out of town, heading for the jagged peaks that pierced the sky. The woman on his mule was a complete unknown, a faceless burden he had just exchanged his entire livelihood for. He told himself it was a fool's errand, an act of pity he couldn't afford. But as they left the stench of Redemption Creek behind, and the clean, pine-scented air of the high country filled his lungs, he felt the first stirrings of something other than loneliness. He had made a bargain. Now he would have to live with it. The sack remained on her head, a barrier of burlap and shame between them, and for the entire 3-hour journey up the winding mountain path, neither of them spoke a single word. The journey to Jordan's cabin was a silent pilgrimage. The only sounds were the plodding hooves of the mule, the whisper of the wind through the tall pines, and the frantic beating of 2 very different hearts. For the woman, every step was a terrifying journey, deeper into the unknown, away from a public hell into a private one. She was the property of a giant silent man who had bought her like a sack of flour, a man who lived where the maps ended. For Jordan, the silence was a familiar companion, but today it was heavy with the presence of the woman behind him. He didn't know what to do, what to say. He was a man of actions, not words. He knew how to track a buck for 2 days, how to read a storm in the clouds, how to build a shelter that could withstand a blizzard. He didn't know how to comfort a person. His cabin came into view as the sun began to dip below the western peaks, painting the sky in fiery strokes of orange and purple. It wasn't much a sturdy log structure he'd built, with his own 2 hands, smoke curling from its stone chimney, nestled in a small meadow overlooking a vast, breathtaking valley. It was his fortress, his hermitage, and he had just brought a stranger into its heart. He slid her off the mule's back. She swayed on her feet, and he steadied her with a hand on her arm. She was smaller than he'd thought, and trembled under his touch. Inside, he said, his voice gruff. He led her through the door. The cabin was sparse but clean. A stone fireplace dominated one wall, a bed with a bearskin blanket in the corner, a rough-hewn table, and 2 chairs in the center. A stew bubbled softly over the fire, filling the small space with the scent of venison and wild herbs. For a moment, it almost felt like a home. She stood rigidly in the middle of the room, her hands clasped in front of her, the sack still covering her head. The final barrier. The moment of truth. Jordan felt a strange trepidation. What was he about to find? Croft's words echoed in his mind. Unsatisfactory. As ugly as they say. Was her face scarred, disfigured? He steeled himself. It didn't matter. He hadn't bought her for her looks. He had bought her because no person deserved what she had endured. You can take that off now, he said, his voice softer than he intended. She didn't move. Her breathing was shallow, audible in the quiet room. She was terrified. Jordan sighed, a long, weary sound. He stepped closer, his large frame casting a shadow over her. "I'm not going to hurt you," he said. He reached out slowly, his calloused fingers hesitating for a second before touching the twine at her neck. He worked the knot loose, his movements clumsy. The twine fell away. He lifted his hands to the bottom of the sack. "Close your eyes if you want." He drew the burlap up and over her head. The firelight washed over her. Her hair, the color of spun gold, was matted and filled with dust, but it cascaded over her shoulders in unruly waves. Her face was smudged with dirt and streaked with tears, her lips were chapped, and a purple bruise was beginning to form on her cheekbone, likely from Croft's rough handling. But there were no scars, no disfigurements. There was only beauty. A face so fine and delicate, it seemed it belonged in a different world, with high cheekbones, a straight nose, and a dusting of freckles. And it was a face he knew. The world tilted on its axis. The air rushed from Jordan's lungs as if he'd been punched in the gut. He stumbled back a step, his hand flying to the wall to steady himself. He froze a statue, carved from shock and horror. It couldn't be. It was impossible. He hadn't seen that face in 5 years. Not since the day of the cave-in. Not since he had clawed his way out of the darkness and left his best friend, his brother, in all but blood, buried under 1,000 tons of rock. Her eyes, wide with fear, snapped open to meet his. They were the same eyes. The same impossible emerald green eyes as her brother. Amelia, he whispered the name, a ghost on his lips, a name he hadn't dared to speak in half a decade. Amelia O'Connell. The woman, the rejected bride, the girl he had just bought for a pouch of pelts, began to tremble violently. Recognition dawned in her own eyes, followed by a wave of pure, unadulterated terror. She knew him. Jordan, she breathed, her voice cracking. Jordan Hayes. The stew bubbled on the fire, the logs crackled. But Jordan heard nothing but the roar of rushing rock in his memory, the ghost of a scream. He was back in the darkness of the Black Tooth Mine, the dust choking him, the weight of the world pressing down. He saw Liam O'Connell's face smiling at him, one moment gone the next. Liam, who had followed him west for a grand adventure. Liam, whose life had been entrusted to him. Liam, whom he had failed. He had run to this mountain to escape that memory, to punish himself with solitude. He had built a fortress of silence and loneliness to keep the ghosts at bay. And now the biggest ghost of all was standing in his cabin, wearing a dirty dress and the face of his unending guilt. He had bought Liam O'Connell's little sister, the girl he had sworn to Liam he would always look out for if anything ever happened to him. He looked at her, truly looked at her. He saw not just Amelia, but the spectre of his own failure. The promise he had shattered. He couldn't breathe. He turned, shoving the cabin door open with such force that it slammed against the outer wall, and fled into the cold, unforgiving twilight of the mountain, leaving her standing alone in the firelight, a living, breathing testament to the past he could never outrun. The mountain night was cold, but Jordan didn't feel it. He stood on the precipice overlooking the valley, the wind whipping at his buckskin shirt, trying to drag the frigid air into lungs that refused to cooperate. Amelia O'Connell, here, in his sanctuary. It was a cosmic joke of the cruelest kind. He had fled Redemption Creek after the mine collapse, leaving everything behind. He couldn't face the O'Connell family, couldn't look into their eyes and tell them he was alive while their son was not. He'd heard they'd moved away, not long after back east, broken by the tragedy. He'd allowed himself to believe they were safe, that Amelia was growing up, living a life, untouched by the darkness that had consumed him. To find her here in this state, shamed, souled bruised, was like a knife twisting in a wound that had never healed. And he was the one who had bought her. The irony was so bitter it choked him. He had paid for the right to be near the one person on earth who represented his greatest shame. He stayed out until the moon was high and the stars were like chips of ice in the black sky, his guilt warring with his confusion. Why was she here? Why the name Vance? What had happened to her family? What had driven her to a mail-order bride contract with a monster like Alex Croft? When he finally returned to the cabin, the fire had been banked, casting a soft, flickering glow. Amelia was not where he had left her. For a panicked moment, he thought she had run off into the wilderness, a fate as good as a death sentence. Then he saw her. She was huddled on the floor in the farthest corner from the door, wrapped in a thin blanket from his cot, asleep from sheer emotional and physical exhaustion. She looked so young, so vulnerable. The proud girl he remembered from 5 years ago was gone, replaced by this haunted woman. A wave of fierce, protective instinct washed over him, so powerful it startled him. It was the echo of his promise to Liam. "Look after her for me, Jed. She's all the family I've got." He gently lifted her. She stirred a small, frightened sound, escaping her lips, but didn't wake. He was struck by how light she was, as if the hardships of the world had whittled her away. He laid her on his bed, the only bed, and covered her with the heavy bare skin. He then took the remaining blanket and settled himself in a chair by the cold hearth to stand watch through the night. Sleep would not come. The next few days were an exercise in suffocating silence. The air in the small cabin was thick with unspoken questions and shared trauma. They moved around each other like ghosts, two souls trapped in the same small space, yet separated by a canyon of guilt and sorrow. Jordan was functional, but remote. He chopped wood with a ferocity that bordered on violence, hunted with a grim determination, and spoke only in monosyllables. Eat. Stay inside. Don't wander. Amelia, for her part, was a portrait of quiet resilience. After the first day of timidly staying in her corner, she seemed to decide that inaction was a worse prison than the cabin itself. She found a broom and swept the floor. She washed the few dishes he owned in a bucket of cold stream water. She discovered his meager stores of flour and salt, and using the venison he provided, managed to bake small hard cakes on a hot stone by the fire. They weren't good, but they were food made with care, an offering of peace in their silent war. He would watch her from the corner of his eye as she worked. He saw the efficiency in her movements, the strength in her slender frame. This was not a fragile doll from the East. She had known hardship. The question was, what kind? One evening, 4 days after her arrival, he returned from checking his trap lines to find the cabin filled with the scent of something floral. Amelia had found a patch of wild lavender and had placed small bunches of it in tin cups around the room. She was kneading dough on the table, her brow furrowed in concentration. She had washed her hair in the stream. It was drying by the fire, a curtain of shimmering gold. For the first time, the cabin felt less like his fortress and more like a home. The realization unsettled him profoundly. He placed a brace of rabbits on the table with a thud. She jumped, startled. "I can skin those," she said softly, her voice still raspy. "I'll do it," he grunted, moving to take them. "Please," she insisted, her green eyes meeting him for the first time, without fear, but with a weary sort of pleading. "Let me help. I can't just sit here." He hesitated, then nodded curtly and stepped back. He watched as she took his skinning knife, her movements deft and sure. She had done this before. Where did you learn that he asked the question, slipping out before he could stop it? She didn't look up from her work. After the mine, Pa, he wasn't the same. The money was gone. We moved to a small tenant farm in the Ohio Valley. There was no one to do the work but us. Her voice was flat, devoid of emotion, a simple recitation of facts. The silence returned, but it was different now. A small crack had appeared in the wall between them. Later that night, as a storm raged outside, rattling the windows and shaking the sturdy log walls, a particularly loud clap of thunder made Amelia gasp, dropping the mending she was doing on one of his shirts. Jordan looked up from the arrowheads he was sharpening. He saw her face pale in the firelight, her eyes wide with a familiar terror. It wasn't the thunder she was afraid of. It was the deep, rumbling sound, the sound of the earth moving. The mine, he stated, his voice quiet. She nodded, wrapping her arms around herself. "Sometimes I still hear it in my sleep, the sound of the mountain falling." He put down his arrowhead and the flint. He walked to the fireplace and added another log, coaxing the flames higher to beat back the shadows. He didn't know the words to offer comfort. He had forfeited that right 5 years ago. So he offered the only thing he could. "I was there," he said, his back to her. "I was with him. At the end." He felt her gaze on his back. He could feel the weight of the question she dared not ask. What happened? But he couldn't give her the answer. Not yet. The guilt was still too raw, living thing that clawed at his throat. He turned back to his chair, picked up his work, and the silence descended once more, heavier and more painful than ever before. But now it was a shared silence, a quiet acknowledgement of the tragedy that bound them together, whether they wanted it to or not. A week bled into 2. A fragile, unspoken routine formed in the mountain cabin. Jordan would rise before dawn, his movements silent, as he prepared for the day's hunt. He would leave a bucket of fresh water and firewood by the door, and when he returned at dusk, there would be a simple meal waiting. The cabin would be clean, and Amelia would be sitting by the fire, mending his clothes, or reading from one of the 2 books he owned, a worn Bible and a tattered copy of Shakespeare. The change in his life was profound. For 5 years, the cabin had been a shell, a place to sleep and eat. Now it held a warmth that had nothing to do with the fire. He found himself looking forward to returning at the end of the day to the quiet companionship that filled the empty spaces of his life. He learned the cadence of her breathing as she slept, the way she hummed softly to herself when she thought he wasn't listening, the determined set of her jaw when she mastered a new task, like splitting kindling or setting a snare for squirrels. He started speaking more, not much, but enough. He taught her the names of the trees, the lodgepole pine, the aspen, the Douglas fir. He showed her which berries were safe to eat and which mushrooms would kill a man before he could say a prayer. In return, she brought a softness to his harsh world. She found a way to make bread that rose. She organized his chaotic supplies, and she spoke to him of things he had long forgotten, of music and poetry, and the world beyond his mountain. The ghost of Liam O'Connell still stood between them, a constant, silent chaperone. But around that ghost, a delicate tendril of something new was beginning to grow. A mutual respect, a cautious dependency, a fragile bud of affection. The past, however, was not content to remain buried. Jordan was tracking an elk high on a ridge one afternoon when a flicker of movement in the valley below caught his eye. It wasn't the natural movement of wildlife. It was two men on horseback, picking their way up the same trail he had brought Amelia on. Townsfolk. His hand went instantly to the rifle slung over his back. No one from Redemption Creek ever came this high up. They were too afraid of the bears, the wolves, and the stories they told about him. Unless they weren't here for him. A cold dread washed over him. He abandoned the elk track and began to move down the mountain, silent and fast, a predator now hunting the men. He cut through the trees, staying parallel to the trail, keeping the riders in his sights. He recognized them as they drew closer. They were Hank and Dusty, two hired thugs who did Alex Croft's dirty work. Their intentions were as clear as the mountain air. Croft had sent them. For Amelia. He reached the clearing around his cabin, minutes before they did his heart pounding with a cold, protective fury. He burst through the door, his rifle in his hand. Amelia was outside, gathering laundry from a line she had strung between two pines. She looked up, startled by his sudden appearance, her eyes wide with alarm. Inside. Now he commanded, his voice a low, urgent growl. "Get my pistol from the chest. Bar the door. What is it, Jordan? What's wrong? No time. Do it!" She saw the look in his eyes, the look of a wolf defending its territory, and she ran inside without another word. Jordan melted back into the trees at the edge of the clearing, concealing himself behind a thick pine, his rifle resting in the crook of its branches. He was calm now, his senses sharp, the world narrowing to the two riders who were now dismounting 50 yards from his cabin. "Well, looky here," Hank Dusty said, his voice carrying in the still air. "The monster's den." Croft was right. He brought the girl here. "Mr. Croft wants his property back," Hank called out towards the cabin. "Send out the woman Hayes and we'll leave you to your miserable mountain. We got no quarrel with you." The cabin door remained shut. "Don't make this difficult," Dusty shouted, unholstering his pistol. "We know she's in there. Croft paid good money for her." A cold rage, purer and hotter than any he had ever known, burned in Jordan's chest. Property. The word was a desecration. He thought of Amelia, her resilience, her quiet dignity, the way she had started to smile at him when she thought he wasn't looking. She was not property. She was everything. "She's not going anywhere." Jordan's voice boomed from the trees, startling the two men. They spun around, pistols drawn, their eyes searching the dense woods wildly. "Show yourself, Hayes!" Hank yelled, his bravado wavering. "You're on my land," Jordan said, his voice seeming to come from everywhere at once. "You have 10 seconds to get on your horses and ride away. After that, I'll consider you trespassers. And I don't take kindly to trespassers." Dusty, the younger and more reckless of the two, raised his pistol and fired a shot into the woods in the general direction of the voice. The bullet whizzed harmlessly past Jordan's head and thudded into a tree. That was the last mistake he would make. Before the echo of the gunshot had even faded, Jordan's rifle cracked once. It was not a warning shot. The bullet tore through the fleshy part of Dusty's thigh. He screamed and collapsed to the ground, his pistol falling from his grasp. Hank froze his eyes wide with terror. He stared at his partner, writhing on the ground, then back at the silent, menacing woods. "That was your last chance." Jordan's voice came again, cold as a tombstone. "The next one won't be in the leg. Leave him his horse. Get out." Hank didn't need to be told twice. He holstered his pistol, scrambled onto his horse, and galloped back down the trail without a backward glance, leaving his wounded partner moaning in the dust. Jordan emerged from the trees, his rifle held loosely at his side, his eyes fixed on the man on the ground. Dusty stared up at him, his face a mask of pain and fear. "Please, don't kill me," he whimpered. Jordan walked over and kicked the man's pistol far out of his reach. He then went to the remaining horse, pulled a canteen from the saddle and tossed it to Dusty. "Get on your horse and ride back to your master." Jordan said, his voice flat, "And you give Alex Croft a message from me. You tell him Emilia is under my protection now. You tell him if he or any of his men ever set foot on this mountain again, I will bury them on it." With a pained grunt, Dusty dragged himself to his horse and managed to pull himself into the saddle. He rode away, leaving a trail of blood in the dirt. Jordan stood there for a long moment, the adrenaline slowly draining away, leaving him feeling hollowed out. He had just declared war on the most powerful man in the valley. He had tied his fate irrevocably to the woman inside his cabin. The door creaked open. Emilia stood on the threshold, his pistol clutched in her hands, her face pale, but her eyes blazing. She had seen it all through a crack in the window shutter. She looked from the bloodstain on the ground to the towering, formidable man standing before her. He was no longer just Jordan Hayes, the man who carried the ghost of her brother. He was the man who had just faced down armed men for her. He had called her by her name and declared her under his protection. In that moment, the last of her fear of him vanished, replaced by a surge of gratitude and an emotion she didn't dare to name. She lowered the pistol. "Jordan," she whispered. He looked at her, and for the first time, she saw past the guilt and the grief in his eyes. She saw the raw, untamed wilderness of his soul, and she realized with a certainty that shook her to her core that she was no longer afraid of it. She was safe here. The aftermath of the confrontation left the cabin shrouded in a new kind of tension. It wasn't the silence of avoidance anymore, but the charged stillness before a storm breaks. The violence had shattered their fragile routine and forced a truth into the open. Alex Croft would not simply let her go. Jordan's mountain was no longer a sanctuary, but a fortress under siege. That evening they ate their meal in near silence, but their eyes kept meeting across the small table. Emilia watched Jordan. He seemed more formidable than ever, yet there was a deep weariness in the set of his shoulders. He had invited danger to his door for her sake. The weight of that sacrifice settled upon her. Jordan watched Emilia. She wasn't cowering or weeping. There was a fire in her eyes he hadn't seen before, a strength that mirrored the granite of the mountains themselves. She was not a victim to be pitied. She was a survivor. His respect for her deepened into something akin to awe. After they had cleared the plates, she did not retreat to her corner. She stood by the hearth, her hands clasped behind her back, and looked at him directly. "Why did you do that, Jordan?" she asked, her voice clear and steady. "You could have been killed. You could have just given me to them. It would have been the easier path." He was cleaning his rifle, his large hands methodical and precise. He didn't stop, but his movements slowed. "Easier ain't always right," he said, not looking at her. "He won't stop," she said. Alex Croft is not a man who accepts defeat. He sees me as an insult to his pride. He'll send more men. He might even come himself. Let him come, Jordan replied, a low growl in his voice as he finally looked up, his grey eyes meeting hers. This mountain has broken better men than him. A log in the fireplace popped, sending a shower of sparks up the chimney. The moment stretched thick with unspoken feelings. "You don't owe me this," Emilia said softly. "You don't owe me anything." The words hung in the air, but they both knew what she was truly saying. "You think you owe my brother. You think you owe me because of him. But you don't." Jordan finally set the rifle aside. He stood up, and the small cabin seemed to shrink around him. He walked to the window and stared out into the impenetrable darkness. 5 years ago, he began his voice, rough with unshed grief. Liam and I were working the deep seam in the Black Tooth. We were chasing a vein of silver. He was so excited. He was going to use his share to buy you and your folks a real house, set you all up properly. Emilia wrapped her arms around herself, her knuckles white. She had never heard the details. No one had. Jordan was the only survivor. The foreman, a man named Peters, said the timbers weren't safe, that the south wall was unstable. I was arrogant. I was the best miner there, and I thought I knew better. I told Liam we'd be in and out in an hour. One more load, that's all. He trusted me. Jordan's voice cracked. He braced his hand against the cold window pane. I heard the groan first, a sound from the belly of the earth. I yelled for him to run. He was behind me. The timbers splintered like matchsticks. The world just ended. It was black. The dust was so thick you couldn't breathe. I was pinned by a crossbeam, my leg shattered. I could hear him. I could hear him calling for me. Tears streamed silently down Emilia's face, but she made no sound. He wasn't far. He was trapped. His legs were crushed. We talked for, I don't know how long. Hours. In the dark. He told me to tell you. He told me to tell you he was sorry he wouldn't be able to buy you that house. He made me promise. He made me promise I'd look out for you. Jordan's massive frame shuddered with a sob he had held in for 5 long years. Then the second collapse came, a bigger one. It shifted the rock that had me pinned. It opened up a small crawl space, but it silenced him. I called his name until my throat was raw. There was nothing, just silence. It took me a full day to crawl out of that hell, and when I did, I ran. I ran from his ghost, from my promise from you. I ran up here to die, I think, but I was too stubborn for that. He turned from the window, his face a wreck of anguish and guilt. So yes, Emilia, I owe you. I owe you a life. His life. A debt I can never repay. The confession, raw and agonizing, filled the space between them. Emilia finally understood the depth of the burden he carried. It wasn't just grief. It was a profound, soul-crushing guilt. She crossed the room in 3 steps and stood before him. She looked up into his tormented eyes, and what she felt was not anger, not blame, but an overwhelming wave of compassion. She reached up and placed her small hand on his tear-stained cheek. His skin was rough, but he was trembling. "It wasn't your fault, Jordan," she whispered, her voice thick with her own tears. "Liam made his own choices. He followed you because he believed in you, because he loved you. He wouldn't want you to live like this, punishing yourself in this prison of regret." His resolve shattered. He pulled her into his arms, burying his face in her hair, and for the first time since he was a boy, he wept. He wept for his friend, for his failure, for the 5 years of lonely, silent penance. Emilia held him tightly, her own sorrow, mingling with his, a shared catharsis in the heart of the wilderness. They were no longer a man and a woman, haunted by the same ghost. They were two survivors clinging to each other in the wreckage of their past. When his sobs finally subsided, he'd loosened his grip but didn't let her go. He looked down at her, his hands framing her face, his thumbs gently wiping away her tears. "Now you tell me," he said, his voice still thick. "How did you end up with Croft, your family? I thought you all went back east." Amelia took a deep breath, the story pouring out of her in a rush. "We did. But Pa was a broken man after Liam. He drank, the farm failed. He passed away 2 years ago. Ma followed him that winter of a broken heart, I think. I was alone. I worked as a seamstress, but it wasn't enough. I was starving. I saw an advertisement for a mail-order bride. It promised a new life, a respectable husband. Alex Croft's letter was charming. He painted a picture of a wonderful life in Redemption Creek." Her expression hardened. The man in the letters was not the man I met. From the moment I arrived, he was possessive, cruel. He told me he owned me, that my body and my will were his. On our wedding night, he was drunk. He tried to force himself on me. I fought back. I hit him with a water pitcher. That's how I got this bruise. She touched her cheek. He flew into a rage, said I was a defective, disobedient shrew, that he would make an example of me so no woman would ever defy her husband again. The next morning, he dragged me into the street and put that sack on my head. Jordan's hands clenched into fists. The rage he felt now was clean and sharp, a righteous fire. It burned away the last vestiges of his guilt, replacing it with a singular, unshakable purpose. He looked at the woman in his arms, brave, battered, but unbroken. The pull he felt towards her was no longer about duty or a debt to the dead. It was about her, about Amelia. He lowered his head, slowly giving her every chance to turn away. She didn't. She tilted her face up to his, her green eyes full of a trust that healed something deep within him. He kissed her. It was not a kiss of passion, but of profound tenderness. It was a kiss of shared sorrow and newfound hope, a silent promise made by firelight, a promise that their pasts would no longer define them. From this moment on, they would face the future and Alex Croft together. The aftermath of their shared confessions changed the very air in the cabin. The silence that fell between them was no longer a wall of guilt, but a comfortable space of understanding. They were partners now, bound by more than just a shared tragedy. But their newfound peace was a fragile thing, a single candle burning in a gathering storm. They both knew Alex Croft would not be deterred. His pride had been wounded, and a man like that was more dangerous than a cornered grizzly. "We can't just wait here for him to come back," Amelia said one evening, her voice steady as she looked into the fire. "This is your home, Jordan. I won't be the reason you lose it. And I refuse to spend the rest of my life looking over my shoulder." Jordan looked at her, his heart swelling with a fierce pride. The timid woman he had brought up the mountain was gone, replaced by a woman of iron will. "What are you suggesting? We go back," she said, her eyes resolute. "We go back to Redemption Creek and face him. Not with violence, but with the truth. Croft rules that town through fear. It's time someone showed them he's just a bully, not a king." It was a terrifying prospect. For Jordan it meant facing the world he had abandoned. For Amelia it meant returning to the very stage of her humiliation. Yet looking at her determined face, he knew she was right. Hiding was not a life. "All right," he said, his voice firm. "We go back. But we do it smart." 2 days later, they rode down the mountain. They were a united front. Jordan formidable on his horse, with his rifle across his lap, and Amelia sitting tall on the mule, her gaze unwavering. They skirted the main street, heading for the back of the general store. "Stay hidden here," Jordan instructed, leaving her in a small copse of trees. "I'll be back." He slipped into the store's storeroom, startling the owner, Martha Gable. Jordan Hayes. "You gave me a fright. What are you doing in town? I heard Croft sent men after you. They found us." Jordan said, his voice low. "Martha, I need your help. Is Sheriff Brody still a man of conscience, or does Croft own him completely?" Martha's lips thinned. "Brody's a good man, but Croft holds the deed to his house. He walks a fine line. Why the woman I took? Croft lied. He abused her, and we mean to set the record straight. Her name is Amelia O'Connell." Martha gasped, her eyes wide. The story of the Black Tooth Mine disaster and the O'Connell family was a local legend. Liam O'Connell's sister, the same. "Can you get a message to Brody? Tell him to meet me here." After dark, alone. Martha, seeing the righteous fire in Jordan's eyes, simply nodded. "He'll be here." That night in the dusty storeroom, Sheriff Brody met them, his hand resting cautiously on his sidearm. "Hayes, this is a big risk. We know," Jordan said, stepping aside to reveal Amelia. Sheriff Amelia began, her voice clear. "Alex Croft lured me here under false pretenses. When I defended myself from him on our wedding night, he beat me. The story he told the town was a lie to hide his own brutality." She presented her journal and a folded letter. "This journal details his threats, and this letter, written by Alex Croft himself, details his plan to swindle my father out of his share of their business years ago. It proves he is a cheat and a predator." Brody read the letter, his weary face hardening. "This is damning, Mom. But his word is against yours, even with this—" "Croft owns the judge. We're not asking for a trial," Jordan cut in. "We're asking for a chance for Amelia to speak the truth to the town. Croft's power is built on fear. We mean to tear it down." Tomorrow at noon, Amelia said, her voice ringing with newfound strength, "I will stand in the spot where he shamed me, and I will tell everyone the truth. All we ask of you, Sheriff, is to be there, to ensure I have the right to speak." Sheriff Brody looked from the incriminating letter to Amelia's bruised but defiant face. He was tired of being afraid. He straightened his shoulders. "I'll be there," he said. "But you should know, Croft will be too, and he won't be coming to talk." Word spread through Redemption Creek like a fever. By noon the next day, the main street was packed. At the stroke of 12, Jordan and Amelia emerged from beside the general store. They walked side by side, a silent, powerful statement. They stopped at the foot of the auction block, reclaiming the ground of Amelia's deepest shame. Across the square, the saloon doors burst open, and Alex Croft appeared, flanked by his hired guns. His face was a mask of purple rage. "This is a farce," he bellowed. "Sheriff, I demand you arrest this kidnapper and return my legal wife to me." Sheriff Brody moved to the center of the square, a calm barrier between the factions. "Now, Alex," he said, his voice steady. "This is a public street. The lady has a right to speak." Croft sputtered in fury at the betrayal, but Amelia was already stepping forward. Her voice, clear and strong, carried to every corner of the silent square. "My name is Amelia O'Connell," she began. "You all saw me here 2 weeks ago, branded a rejected bride. Mr. Croft told you I was disobedient." "He lied." She turned her gaze on Croft. "The truth is that Alex Croft is a thief and a coward. Years ago he cheated my father, a man you knew as Liam O'Connell's father, and drove my family into ruin." A murmur rippled through the crowd. "He sent for me, not as a wife, but as a possession. When I fought to defend myself from his drunken assault, he beat me." He put that sack on my head to hide his crime, not my face. He shamed me to salvage his own pathetic pride." Her words struck a chord. The townspeople looked at Croft and saw the same bully who held their debts and threatened their businesses. "He rules you the same way," Emilia cried out. "With fear and lies, but his power is an illusion, lies." Croft shrieked, his composure shattering. He ripped a small derringer from his coat. "She is my property." He aimed the pistol at Emilia. But before his finger could tighten on the trigger, Sheriff Brody's Colt was drawn and leveled at his chest. "Drop it, Alex." At the same instant, Jordan moved. He was a blur of buckskin and fury, closing the distance in 3 long strides. He didn't use his rifle. A brutal backhand sent the derringer flying. He then grabbed Croft by his suit, lifting the sputtering man clear off the ground. Croft's hired guns, seeing the sheriff's unwavering aim and the mountain man's murderous rage, wisely raised their hands. Jordan held the terrified Croft inches from his face. "You will never," he snarled his voice, a low, terrifying rumble touch her again. "You will never speak her name again. You will sign over the deed to the sheriff's house and cancel every debt you hold over these people. Then you will ride out of this valley. If I ever see your face again, I will bury you where you stand." He dropped Croft in a heap of shame in the dust. The tyrant of Redemption Creek was broken. A moment of stunned silence was shattered by a single person clapping. It was Martha Gable. Then the entire square erupted in cheers, a wave of relief and liberation. Jordan ignored them all. He walked to Emilia, his expression softening as he gently touched the fading bruise on her cheek. "It's over," he said softly. A radiant smile spread across her face as she placed her hand over his. "No," she replied. "It's just beginning." They rode away from the cheering town, back up the familiar mountain path. The cabin that greeted them was no longer a fortress of solitude or a prison of guilt. As the sun set, casting long shadows across the valley, it stood as a promise. It was home. Jordan and Emilia's story shows us that even in the harshest wilderness, and from the deepest wells of shame and guilt, love and redemption can blossom. Their journey wasn't just about surviving the Wild West, it was about surviving the past. They proved that true strength isn't found in solitude or revenge, but in the courage to face your demons, to speak your truth, and to find a home in the heart of another. They transformed a cabin of lonely penance into a sanctuary of shared love, proving that a future is not something you run to, but something you build together. Stone by stone, promise by promise. If their incredible story of courage, healing, and love in the face of impossible odds moved you, please show your support. Hit that like button, share this video with someone who loves a story of true grit, and be sure to subscribe for more tales of the untamed heart. Your support helps us keep these stories alive. Thank you for listening.